Finally, I'd like to welcome someone who needs no introduction. He's been an integral and an important part of Mass Mental for some 30 years. He's been responsible for attracting bright and sensitive people to our hospital. He knew and was a close friend of Dr. Semrad, and we are very sad to lose him. He's made major contributions to the field of psychiatry, is a lucid and compelling writer, and an incredible speaker. Please welcome Dr. Leston Havens.
Is a story that Susan has heard so many times that I hesitate to tell it again, but I must say it is appropriate. It's Winston Churchill's after-dinner story, and it goes something like this. The great man said once that he understood mathematics, all about it. Sines turning into cosines, zero passing into infinity, the whole thing, he said, unfolded like the Lord Mayor's parade. But it was after dinner, and I let it go. Well, I feel that way about these remarks. Despite the fact that I'm very flattered that you asked me, I'm especially flattered because the House Staff Association, the residents at Mass Mental are an extraordinary bunch of people. The quality of the resident staff, despite what George modestly says in his speech, is really quite extraordinary, and at the level, and perhaps above the level, of any of the bygone years. I don't see many of the old faces here, but one of the things I've noticed about people as they get older and look back at their experiences, that they tend to feel that they came from a time of giants, people of incredible understanding and cleverness, and that the present generation is obviously more or less passé. And those of you who share that myth of coming from a land larger than life, let me tell you that it isn't that way at all. I had additional illustration of that fact very recently because I was invited to be invited to judge the the Solomon Award papers, and I read 20 of these damn things, which at first blush almost did me in. But when I got to read them, I thought they were astonishing. I thought they were just marvelous. And my hat's off to you all. It has really was edifying. I learned a great deal. It was impossible to decide among them except in the most typically psychiatric, subjective way. And they were really a very impressive demonstration of the very high level, perhaps the ascending level, that this extraordinary institution has maintained. Now, what I want to do with the rest of your patience that remains, which surely must be not so much, what I want to do with the rest of your patience that remains is to talk about two aspects of Elvin that that are interesting to me because they're both paradoxical. And the first I'll put this way, that Elvin had a message that in some respects was revolutionary, and in others, but he was a man with a message in some respects revolutionary who had an extraordinarily unrevolutionary temperament. I'm going to try to get away from this thing. Is that all right? Can you hear me now?
No, that's just good for me.
Oh, I have to use this thing. Henry, I thought you told me I could just...
You can move anywhere you want.
But no one can hear me. Well, that's it. I see. That's the a speech of the visual minded, right? So that my first problem for you is the problem of a man who had in some respects an unusual message, but was a profoundly unrevolutionary, an uncombative temperament. His solution to that problem, or rather the solution imposed upon him to a considerable extent, was a solution of becoming what is called a guru, which I understand is a Sanskrit word that means a revered one, a venerable one. In other words, he disappeared into a kind of a personal message. However, the second paradox is that he was not a guru. He was a profoundly modest man, a genuinely humble man. And so this is the second of the paradoxes. And it's those two elements of his life and his times that I want to try to illuminate a little bit in these remarks. I don't think it requires any heavy going at all to convince you that he was an unrevolutionary temperament. His favorite motto when confronted by any bureaucratic problem at all was, "You can't fight City Hall." And he quite genuinely meant it. I never saw him at any point in his life fight City Hall. And considering that some of the city halls, despite Miles's commendatory remarks about them, considering some of the city halls that were to fight, that shows a degree of modesty, as I will return to, of an extraordinary level. He had another motto, too, which bore on the same trait, this non-revolutionary temperament I'm talking about. When he was confronted by somebody who was difficult, he used to say to me, and as I'm sure he said to many others, he used to say, "Give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves." Now, there's a lot to be said for that. The keenest illustration of its relevance used to come in his arguments with my other principal teacher, who was Ives Hendrick. Elvin would haul out rope for Ives by the mile. And Ives would entangle himself in it into a stultifying rage. And one of the more bizarre memories of my almost 30 years at Mass Metal was coming one day on the corridor right across from where Rita has her house, still probably has her office, and finding Ives Hendrick, whom most of you don't remember, but was a kind of a bull-like, paranoid man, very, very brilliant, but terribly difficult, and finding him staggering along the corridor in his kind of misshapen way, at the other end of which was Elvin, who was sort of standing there quietly, as he was wont to, shouting at him, "I'm a bull! I'm a bull and you're a cow!" Huh? Well, there was a truth to it, too. There was the phallic, the penile, was always the climax, both literally and figuratively, of Ives's presentations and his clinical discussions. And here he was demonstrating to the relatively passive and Elvin this bullishness that he made such a thing of. But the result was, of course, that by accepting this, by bailing out this rope in Ives's direction, Ives was made to look like a complete ass. Not a bull at all, but a complete ass. And out of that, Elvin emerged with real dignity. It didn't always work that way. And I wish that Lester Grinspoon were here tonight so that I could not talk behind his back, but there was and I mean that very seriously. But, for example, there came a time in the development of Jack Ewalt's reign of office at Mass Metal, when there was proposed an idea of testing various drugs and psychotherapy on chronically psychotic people, and there was a design of a very elaborate kind, very carefully worked out, and I was asked to take part in it, and I said that I wouldn't take part in it because it was a set-up job. It was impossible to do what they were expecting psychotherapy to do. It takes 4 or 5 years of psychoanalysis to affect very much. What are you going to do with chronically psychotic people in 2 years? What you're going to do is demonstrate that psychotherapy doesn't work. Well, that isn't all the study demonstrated. It has some interest. But the fact is that here Elvin allowed himself to have his name attached to a document, not one of the leading names, but as part of a document, in which his life work, the importance of personal contact in the care of schizophrenic people, was essentially attacked. And that study is still used by many people as evidence that psychological work is not useful in schizophrenia. That was a case where giving out the rope didn't hang poor old Ives, but it surely did hang at least part of Elvin's message. Well, that was his temperament. That was his nature. And I'll come back to it at the end because I want to talk about that modesty in a somewhat different light, in the light of its extraordinary qualities and what the message, it seems to me, it has to offer us. But then there was the message. Here I've said there was this unrevolutionary temperament, but there was an unusual message. And if revolutionary is a little strong, it's not too strong, not very much too strong anyway, as I'll try to demonstrate in a minute. What Elvin tried to do, I think, was simply put, although it's not a simple thing, this. He turned the procedures of psychotherapy upside down. Still, but principally too before his time and during his time, the basic approach to the patient rested on the idea of making things clear to the patient, interpreting and clarifying to the patient. And out of that, certain kinds of change might come, and out of that, certain kind of emotional events might come. Now, Elvin didn't believe things worked that way. He thought they worked the other way. He thought that the feelings came first, and out of that, some understanding might occur. In other words, interpretation was a very secondary device in psychotherapy, and even perhaps in psychoanalysis. My favorite way of saying that was his way of saying it, which he meant in, again, administrative terms, but he also meant in terms of the psychotherapeutic work with patients. He said, if you have to tell someone something, it's already too late. The formula for which he's most well known, of course, is the formula acknowledge, bear, and put in perspective. And notice again that acknowledgement and bearing precede the relatively cognitive or intellectual matter of putting in perspective. Now, this is a message that he didn't get across, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute when I talk about the person I think who was most principally opposed to him intellectually on the Boston scene, Greta Biebring. He didn't get that point across, but that was the message that was the trouble for the world around him. Now you say, why would that message be trouble for the world around him? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. But let me remind you of how hard it has been to get that place of emotion, not simply as a goal, but as a working method into our psychotherapy. We all know that the Europeans have sent us most of what we use. They sent us psychoanalysis. In the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, they sent us somatic treatments. They sent us electric shock treatment, insulin, lobotomy, and they've sent us, of course, the phenothiazines from France. And now they're sending us existential psychiatry. And although it's not fair to say that Elvin Semrad was an existentialist, he was partly one. He was too well trained in other parts of psychiatry to be any one single thing. But he did represent the existential interest in feeling, above all the existential opposition to the role of clarification, intellectualization, and interpretation in all psychotherapeutic work. So that I think if his intellectual story is ever written fully, it will be written around such figures as Carl Rogers, as to some extent Rollo May, although not nearly so clinical, and perhaps most poignantly of all, Heinz Kohut. So that if you feel that Elvin could have fought harder against the climate of his time to what he believed, take a look at the life of Heinz Kohut. And it will, I think, have to be for you a somewhat chilling look. Heinz Kohut, for those of you who are not part of this kind of world, was a very established psychoanalytic figure for many years, the president of the American Psychoanalytic Association, the vice president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He was a major establishment figure in psychoanalysis. And then he decided that what he'd been doing was not sufficient. And he wrote a couple of books which essentially drew him further and further away from the main tradition into the study of narcissism, and particularly into the study of certain kinds of therapeutic interventions of a very existential, empathic kind. he found to his astonishment, this rather quiet man, he found to his astonishment that his former friends, his colleagues, his beloved, dear compatriots in the great voyage of psychoanalysis now had nothing but hatred for him. And if you don't believe me, read the editor of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, Harold Bloom's review of The Restoration of the Self when it came out. It's just a hatchet job of the most ferocious kind. Here was a senior citizen, as well established politically as one could ever be within this context, who found himself literally savaged by his former friends. And I never knew Kohut personally, although I met him a few times and corresponded with him, but I really feel that his own death, his own heart attack and other things of that kind may and well have simply been a broken heart in finding a world around him so little friendly to this honest and striving man's aspirations. So if we wanted more for Elvin than we had, see for a moment the extraordinary climate in which novelty in our field has to fight against. To understand the psychiatric scene, the psychoanalytic scene in Boston in the 50s and the 60s, it's necessary to get some perspective on the other figure who influenced people the most, Greta Biebring. She ran the unit at the Beth Israel. She assembled a very intensely interested group of colleagues. She had an enormous influence on the local scene, both at the collegial level and at the student level. I knew her pretty well. She supervised one of my cases for almost 4 years in the Institute. I had the extraordinary experience, it was like being with the Medici at a certain time in the history of the Italian peninsula, of attending the psychiatric department's executive meetings when she was there with one or two other people, so I could watch that extraordinary lady work. Elvin, when I sat next to him in those meetings, Elvin used to elbow a little, and he'd point at her when she'd start something, because he wanted, and that's as close as he ever came to criticizing her, because he wanted me to see how it is possible to use your personality to get your way. This lady was a marvelous teacher, a fascinating person. I never forget one time when she was supervising me, she told me a story about one of her children, and the child had come home from school one day and had approached her mother, Greta Biebring, Edward Biebring's wife, the colleagues of Freud, and had said to her mother, the little girl had said, "My friend's mother is like this round doll, all sort of fluffy and soft." And the daughter pointed at a porcelain figure, beautifully made and iron hard, and said, "Mother, you're more like that." She said. Now, remember, Greta Biebring is the one that told me this story. She told it on herself. And she knew and was exquisitely aware of this great strength she had, this enormous personality, and the way in which she embodied, I think more than anyone else, the Viennese tradition in Boston, psychoanalysis. Some of you have heard me say before that the Viennese conquered Boston just about as rapidly, perhaps more rapidly, than the British ever conquered the American Indians. And she was, perhaps more than anyone else, the one who was able to do that. Now that tradition, a valuable tradition in certain respects, but not one, as you can see, that I find myself sympathetic with. Nevertheless, that tradition stood for a variety of things. It stood for interpretation. It stood for clarification. It also stood for the authority of Freud. And it stood in a very careful way for what Freud had stood for, that the message should be promulgated, that they should not be allowed to forget. And there's a lot to be said for that. God knows what would have happened to psychoanalysis if it hadn't been protected that way. So there was a lot positive about it. Nevertheless, she stood for the authority, for the tradition, and to some extent for the intellectual tradition of psychoanalysis in America. I couldn't make up my mind whether I would tell you something at this point. She was a wonderful lady, and she certainly treated me well, and I learned a lot from her. But I must say, when she died, I remembered a line from Swinburne, which I had read. It's a line that's in his poem about Julian the Apostate. And I don't give you the background of it, but you'll understand immediately what I mean when I say it. And it seems harsher than I feel, but let me say it. Julian the Apostate falls in Asia Minor, the victim of some enemy arrow. And as he falls, some Christian arrow. Remember, it was Julian the Apostate. And as he falls, he says, "Thou hast conquered, thou pale Galilean, and the world has grown gray with thy dust." That's a very anti-Christian message. But what I meant by mentioning it here was, I think to some extent, our psychiatric practice grew a little gray under the impact of the authority and the tradition and the intellectualization of the great Viennese. Well, what was Elvin to do? I don't think he knew what to do, really, but he didn't have to choose because the world chose for him. The world made him a guru, a venerable one. That is, the world elevated him into a position of sacredness, of almost religious awe, so that the world would not have to confront what he meant. They would only have to confront him. His message disappeared into his person, and it was safe in his person. It was not a safe message in the outside world, but it was safe in his person. I think you get a feeling for that if you read his papers, which are very difficult to read. They remind me of the only piece of geology I think I know, which is that there's a certain stone, not uncommon, I'm told, in New England, called the conglomerate. And the conglomerate is a gray mass into which are put bright stones, other stones. Well, Elvin's papers are conglomerates. The mass of it is gray. It contains the usual jargon, the rites of passage of acceptable utterance. And every now and then in them you will see something which is Elvin. And that was as much as he allowed himself at that point to say. Meantime, we were all busy elevating him into the state of a guru. Sometimes it reminded me of that painting by Botticelli of Venus on the half shell. Do you know that one? Venus is coming in on the half shell in the waves, and her hair is tumbling about her, and her chastely puts her arms across her breasts. But my vision was always that Elvin was on the half shell, and that he was sort of cherubic and pink and round, and had a sort of beatific smile on his face, riding in on the little wavelets to a sort of applauding multitude of guru seekers on the beach. A sort of Czech Jesus representing love, you know. But my real point, of course, is that he wasn't like that at all. He wasn't like that at all. He was really a very hard-nosed man who had very keen perceptions about things, even though he kept his mouth shut for the most part. And he kept his mind open. Furthermore, he knew something which it took me a long time to learn, and that is that he better keep his mouth shut for the reasons I've been mentioning, because he knew that everything in the world is already owned. The land isn't the only thing that's owned. People's minds are owned. It's all owned. I found out that first when I was reading an essay once by Samuel Butler, the English novelist, and in it he said, Butler in his fanciful way was wondering how was it that anybody ever read Aeschylus or put on his plays. They were so incredibly boring. Why did anybody bother about Aeschylus? And so Butler said, well, perhaps Aeschylus somehow got a piece of the public mind. Well, how would he do it? Well, Butler says, making all this up as he goes along, he said that there's only 3 ways you can do it. You buy, you marry, or you fight. Well, Aeschylus was somewhat timid, and he wasn't, in other words, a fighter. He didn't have much money, so Butler surmised that he must have married the producer's daughter. And having married the producer's daughter, they started this long, endless production of Aeschylus's boring plays, right down to the present time. And Butler's point was, though, that it isn't the way you think it is, if you're like the way I used to be, that if you say some wonderful truth, that somehow the world lights up and is ready to receive you. They don't even notice. They don't care. If you're going to take a piece of their minds and own it, you better buy, marry, or fight. I had a funny experience that way when I started out. I wrote a paper I discovered, in fact, a new psychosis induced by ammonia intoxication. And I published it no less in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I went about my way as if I had made some kind of impact somewhere on something. And a year or two later, I was at a meeting. And a man came up to me and he said, oh, I thought your name was, we looked at those little badges people carry, and they looked at it and he said, I thought your name was Paul Havens. Well, it turned out that there was a distinguished hepatologist in Philadelphia with a meeting who they assumed must have written my paper. In other words, he already owned the liver. And when I came into it, there was really no place at all for me. And that was the first inkling I had of the realization of the fact that it's all already in someone else's hands. Now, Elvin knew that. He'd already married, and although Rita would fight with him, she certainly wasn't going to fight with the Institute. He didn't have a great deal of money, and he didn't like to fight. So, as I say, he became a guru. But there was a trouble with his being a guru, as I've told you, and that is that he was a genuinely modest man. And it's on the note of modesty that I want to close. Some of you may wonder why I would talk about modesty. I crossed my mind that was perhaps even inappropriate. And then I remembered that wonderful line of George Bernard Shaw, you know, those who can do, those who can't teach. So I thought that might give me leave to talk about modesty. There are two kinds of modesty. There's real modesty and there's fake modesty. Fake modesty was best introduced to us by Lord Chesterfield when he said to his son, modesty is the best bait to get admiration. And that's quite true. And it's proved, in my opinion, not proved, but it's suggested very strongly by the fact that true modesty does not get admiration. True modesty generally gets neglect. There's a Russian proverb, be a sheep and a wolf will appear. And I really believe that's true. And I think you can make a very good and honest living off of reminding your patients of the dangers of genuine modesty because of the company they will find they will be keeping. But Elvin was genuinely modest. He was genuinely modest. And one of the most telling tests of genuine modesty is the kind of people that you don't fool. One of the reasons that John Darcy, of such recent fame in our community, was able to perpetrate these frauds, not only at Harvard, but also down south and even before that at Holy Cross and Notre Dame, whatever it was, is that he could appeal to other people's vanity. What he proved was a reminder that Peter Gomes should preach in the Harvard chapel every Sunday. The psychopathic person always plays on our greed and our vanity. He should be a constant reminder to all of us, John Darcy. A statue should be put up to him somewhere to remind us of how the best people even can fall victim to a clever person playing on their modesty. But that you couldn't do to Elvin. One time, Don Gert said about him just after he died that he did not deal in illusions, and that made him free of the John Darcys of this world. Many of you have heard me tell my favorite story of that along that line. Let me tell it again, make it brief, but it was a beautiful illustration of this same thing, a proof of his understanding of modesty. Once upon a time, we had a patient at the hospital who was a beautiful Irish boy, freckled and blue-eyed and charming, who had at the age of 10 set fire to a building and burnt up 2 old people. And so he'd been sent out to Metropolitan, to one of the reform schools, then out to Don Gare's place at Gabler. And finally, when he was too old, he was sent to Mass Mental. And the good Lord, in his divine justice, had put him in the perfect place for Jimmy to have it the rest of his life if he wanted. Because Jimmy had a set of ideas, not quite delusions, somewhat like hysterical fantasies, that he was a surgeon, that he was already a surgeon. Well, of course, what God had done was put him right down in the midst of probably the largest concentration of operating rooms in North America, perhaps in the world. And of course, an operating room has a marvelous feature for the life of an... Well, of course, what God had done was put him right down in the midst of probably the largest concentration of operating rooms in North America, perhaps in the world. And of course, an operating room has a marvelous feature for the life of an imposter. Because when you go in, you put those gowns on and you put over a mask, and no one knows who the hell you are. And we were very proud of our open hospital, our unlocked doors, the freedom we gave, the people of all kinds. And so in no time at all, Jimmy was assisting at a good deal of the surgery that went on at the Brigham, the Beth Israel, and the Deaconess. Now, as is so characteristic of this kind of clinical problem, he didn't want to really just be anybody's surgeon. He was looking for God. He was looking for the kind of person he wanted to become. If he'd been lucky enough to bump into August Eichhorn or somebody who could have handled him, he might have had a chance to make a better life for himself. But instead, of course, he found a surgeon. And he found one of the perhaps the most famous surgeon of that day. And he soon was no longer, he'd abandoned the Deaconess, and he'd abandoned the Beth Israel, and he no longer took the tea down to the Massachusetts General. Instead, he was solely concentrated on one other hospital, attending one other surgeon's operations. And so charming was he and so dear that they struck up quite a palship, the two, the great man and young Jim. And soon Jim, who was pretending to be a senior medical student or junior resident dropping in from Emory or someplace like that, had secured a letter from the great man recommending Jimmy for God knows what. And the next step you could also predict. He was found wandering around the great man's house out in one of the affluent suburbs. He was seen eventually. He'd been doing it for weeks before he was caught, looking in the window. The family saw him. They caught him. They found out he was a nut. Furthermore, he was an arsonistic nut. And they went up in flames. Because here he might have destroyed everybody and everything. Indeed, he might have. Well, Elvin and I were supposed to run the clinical services in those days, and I found out all about this, and we knew that the great man was about to call. And he was absolutely furious that we had not kept this dangerous character away from him and his family. And so he was at one end of the phone making an enormous amount of noise in a magnificent voice, and Elvin was at the other holding the phone somewhere like this, so that we both could enjoy it. And after it settled down a little bit, very quietly, very slowly, Elvin said, "Did you know the boy at all?" And there was a hush on the other end, and to the great credit of the surgeon, who saw immediately his mistake, he said, "Oh my God, I did." And Elvin was too tactful to mention the letter, but the message had gotten across. And the interview closed with Elvin saying to the surgeon, he said, "Sometimes a little friendship goes a long way." But that was the kind of friendship which would not have gone a long way with this genuinely modest man. Two more things about his modesty, and I'll close. One was that he had a gift in his modesty which I have found extraordinarily rare. That is, he could inspire people, but he inspired them to do something they wanted to do themselves. Now that's one of the rarest human qualities I've ever seen. The great bulk of inspiration is what I like to call one of life's gilded lemons. It's essentially being taken up into somebody else's desires, into somebody else's purposes, and waking up only 20 years later to find that they have little or nothing to do with you. But he had a gift to at the same time give you a sense of inspiration, and at the same time to give a sense of freedom. And that's a rare thing in my experience indeed. The modest man needs a society of respect. To live properly, he needs an environment of respect. Our world is not such a world. With all due respect for the guardian angels of this faculty club and all the other faculty clubs and institutions of the world, the best description of them is still the description of Darwin in the struggle for existence. The best picture is still the picture you can see if you have the heart to turn on the Channel 2 when they're showing those extraordinary films of the Brazilian jungle floor. And you see that human life is basically a matter of contest between predators and slaves, and that the most innocent creatures in the world can be devoured in a moment by a society in a world which is basically predatory, which is basically out to enslave people, and if not to eat them, at least to turn them into psychological slaves, if not actual slaves. So that teeming world of the Brazilian jungle floor is the world that we all live in. It's the world Elvin lived in, and it says a great deal about the danger of modesty. But this I think he gave us, and this I hope we can continue in some way, not to forget for a moment, as he never forgot, the dangers of the jungle floor, but to keep looking forward and keep trying to develop the possibility that other people's purposes might be equal to our own, that we might look forward to a time when life was not based so much on predation and slavery, but on the kind of mutual respect that he, more than anyone that I ever met, embodied in all the time that I knew him. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Havens, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight and thank in particular our speakers this evening. That concludes the evening.